Good morning, everyone. Please continue to get your food. Absolutely make sure you have a full plate. Don't pause and listen to me, just enjoy your food. I do want to start on time because we have a full program today. I just want to say hello on behalf of Diversity Circles. You can read more about Diversity Circles on our website, and there are also flyers at the side here. If you didn't have a chance to sign in, there's sign up over here at the side if you have a moment sometime during the presentation. And don't be shy about getting up to get more water to drink or tea or whatever. Please look after yourselves and enjoy. We're really honored to be marking the International Week of the Deaf with this presentation, and it should be a great event today. I'm going to introduce my co-researcher, Zah Joseph, to provide acknowledgement of the territories and say a few words also. Thanks, Zah. Oh, sorry, I forgot one thing. I knew I would. There is filming going on today, as you can clearly see. If you really don't absolutely want to be on camera, please let myself or Kyla Epstein at the back there know, and we'll take down your description and endeavor to make sure that you don't appear on camera if you don't want to appear on camera. Sorry about that, Zah. You are good to go.
Thank you, Shannon. As a guest, I'm a Carrier First Nations member. I'm actually technically a guest of the Coast Salish people, and those are the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. So I would like to acknowledge the territory of the unceded Coast Salish people today and recognize that we're looking at and working on those lands. It's a special day for us at Diversity Circles to work with such an amazing community, those within the deaf community. We really have looked towards Jamie and to Piper and to Reese and to our interpreter team here for strength and advice for today. And it's something that we really value within not only Diversity Circles, but here at BCIT, is going to the community and really asking, out of respect and out of a very strong connection, how to navigate these areas of diversity and inclusion and respect. So looking at that, I just, like part of Diversity Circles is us sharing gifts. And Jamie is such an amazing person who has shared a lot of gifts with our team. I was able to travel to COUT, which is the Canadian Association of University Teachers, with Jamie, where he aligned himself with an academic from another university from the deaf community. And I really saw the power of the connection that he has and the expertise that he has as a researcher. And with that, I'll leave it, but there's a few people in the room I think we can connect. And Shannon, you've met, there's also Kyla Epstein, Piper, Colin, and there's a few others, I believe, or Cheryl, and a few others that were on the planning team. Everyone's too shy, they're all sitting down, so that's right. But I would like to end in a different way of putting my hands up. With all my relations and the recognition of the Coast Salish territory, we usually do in all my relations, and that calls not only those within the room today, but our ancestors as well, but also an applause for the crews that have made this happen. So Masi Cho, we'll see him. Thank you very much.
I think I will sign for myself. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
Hello, everyone. I am so inspired and honored to be here to introduce today's speakers, Jamie Finley and Kirsten Hagamone. I have the utmost respect for these two people. And I'm super excited for this workshop and how it coincides with the International Week of the Deaf. How perfect. So just a brief introduction of each of these people. Jamie works here at BCIT. He's a research assistant, and his expertise is in microbiology, analytical research to do with chemistry. He's an expert in the process of fermentation. And he works with NRG, the Natural Health Food Products Research Group. Yay, Jamie. So that's about his work, but I think it's also important to say a little bit more about Jamie as a person. So I asked both of our presenters 3 key questions. I asked them to tell me what is of most value for them in presenting today. I also asked them what their goals are for work, what makes them enjoy getting up and going to work. And thirdly, what is their superpower when you think of that particular topic? And Jamie's reply was, I want to increase awareness on these topics. I think this is important work because of the potential impact on the people that we will connect with. And I love getting up and going to work because I love math. And I've always liked that part of my work. I can fully get into the math part. And Jamie said his superpower is patience. And I think he is extremely patient. Now, when it comes to Kirsten, she is a registered sign language interpreter. She also has a degree in education. And she does contract teaching at Douglas College in the program of sign language interpretation. Her answer to those 3 questions were that she really values the topics that are going to be discussed today because it is amazing how one can connect with people through the community. She values the connections she's made in the deaf community and other communities in her work. And she loves to go to work every day because she likes to see people taking in new information and learning more about accessibility and access. Her superpower, in connection to all of that, is she says that she's in the process of unlearning implicit bias, and she feels that her superpower is recognizing, I don't know everything, I will never know everything, but it's important to make mistakes because that's part of the learning and the growth that we experience. So again, I'm so pleased and honored to introduce Kirsten and Jamie. Take it away. Okay.
I'm just going to speak for a moment, and then I'm going to switch languages. I just want to say, before I say that, thank you so much, Piper, for that lovely introduction. Really appreciate you. So yes, I am a hearing person. My first language is English. I'm bilingual. I've been so lucky to be able to learn ASL from our local deaf community, but for this presentation, I'm going to be signing. So it might be the last time I'm using the microphone.
And I'd also like to say briefly thank you for the introductions. Thank you, Shannon and Zah, for the opportunity to present this workshop. So, to begin, we're not going to start with Jamie and I presenting. We're going to start by showing you a wonderful little video. It was made by a local group of deaf children and youth at a summer camp. And the group is called Deaf Youth Today, DYT. And they are using the hashtag #WhyISign, and each person is explaining that importance to them. And that hashtag got out into the social media circles in 2016, and many people were making short videos and contributing online to answering the question, why I sign. So this particular video is a montage of the local DYT group. So I hope you'll enjoy this video. Oh, before I should just add, there are English subtitles, captions, but we've asked the interpreter to voice them because it goes very quickly and we think you'll get more out of it. But please be patient with the interpreter trying to keep up. We're grateful to Sarah for trying. ASL allows me to share my whole self, my thoughts and feelings and who I am. Clear communication is vital. When I sign, I can fully express myself. I sign because my parents are deaf, so we don't need to sign and talk at the same time. And when I use ASL, my mom understands me best. I'm deaf, so when I sign, I can understand better. I can talk, but sometimes I can't understand. So sign language really helps me. My first experience to language was ASL. I've been signing my entire life, and that's become the foundation of my identity. Without ASL, my identity would be lost. I am capable of communicating. I can communicate better. ASL is a beautiful language, and the more I use it, the more beautiful I think it is. I can communicate. When deaf kids get together, and we're all deaf, we make so many friends. I sign because ASL is my language. We can communicate. ASL makes me feel connected with my community, and that's amazing. Because I can have full access. Because I believe that access to communication should be for everyone. It makes communication easier. I sign because I understand people better, because when they speak to me, I miss a lot. It's fun to use ASL. ASL is best for me. When I was growing up, I used ASL and took speech classes, but I was always more drawn to ASL because it felt comfortable and natural to me, like I had no limits to express myself. And because it's such a rich experience, I think the written English word can never compare. I'm hearing, my mom is deaf, and my dad is hearing. Because of that experience, I carry both worlds within me. With ASL, you could tell a whole story with your body movements and facial expressions. You can share things you can't possibly say in English. Like what I just did. No interpretation. No words. Knowing how to sign means that you can communicate. ASL lets me chat, and have fun, and hang out with other kids. My family is deaf, so ASL is my first language. It helps me understand better. ASL is such a rich language. Using ASL is fun. I can chat with all my friends. ASL is the language I use to communicate myself to others, which then allows me to gain access to a world of understanding. And that makes me feel human, and that is a human right. When I meet people who don't know how to sign, communication can be hard. Using ASL is better. Then I can fully understand everything. When my older brother was born deaf, my family started learning ASL. So when I was born, that quickly became part of my experience too. I still sign because it's vital for me to have that connection. It makes me who I am. I sign because if I couldn't, I wouldn't be able to contribute to a beautiful organization like the DYT. Now, I also sign to share and expose ASL to our campers because they are our future. Very cool. I love watching that video. I think it's so neat. Such a great experience. I recognize many of those faces. Yeah, and so that camp takes place at Hornby Island every year, which is a smaller island off of Vancouver Island. And I think it's been going for 15 to 20 years. And I have been, and it's a cool experience for the deaf youth and families. It has a big impact on a lot of people. So maybe you've noticed already some themes that came up in the comments that people in the video made about why they sign. They talked about communication, they talked about connection, they talked about self-expression and identity, feeling involved, included, and able to engage and relate, all of which is so awesome. So now we have an activity for all of you to do. And of course, the theme for our presentation is 2 views. So we're going to introduce those 2 views about what it means to be deaf. So when you're looking at diversity, you often talk about unconscious bias. We have all internalized many different ideas, and biases throughout our lives. We pick those up from the people we hang out with, from TV and media and the like. And so sometimes when we're out in the world, we react to people based on those internalized biases. So those could be positive or negative, but this is a chance to kind of self-analyze and look at your beliefs about deaf people. What have you come to think that being deaf means? And so we're going to look at different examples that express those 2 different perspectives. So at each table, there's an envelope, and inside the envelope are 14 strips of paper, each one with a statement on it. So altogether, the 14 statements match in 7 pairs. So you look at what each strip of paper says about what it means to be deaf. It expresses a certain belief or a certain perspective. So you should be able to figure out that on the 14 pieces of paper, there are 7 pieces that express one view and 7 strips of paper that express a kind of an opposing view, and then they match up too. So see if you can match them up so that you would end up with 7 that have a certain perspective and 7 that have a different perspective, and you also figured out how they go together in pairs. So spend some time trying to figure that out with the people at your table. Okay, everybody, I think we're going to carry on. If I can get everybody's attention. Hello, hello. Time's up. Sorry, this isn't for marks. You're not getting graded, don't worry. This isn't for grades, you're good. I think there's a little discussion in the back table wanting to get the last answer correct. Okay, here we go. So before we go ahead and show you the quote-unquote right answer, this isn't a test, by the way, I want to recognize the person who developed this activity that you're doing right now. Something that I used to use when I taught in the ASL and Deaf Studies program at Vancouver Community College. And the person who developed the course called Becoming an Ally is Sarah McFadden, who happens to be interpreting right now. An example of how small our deaf world is. And the information in the activity itself was derived from a textbook called So You Want to Become an Interpreter. And that was written by 2 authors, Jan Humphrey and Bob Alcorn. So I just wanted to recognize that source. Okay, Jamie. So let's look at the first slide that shows the comparison between the views. So we're going to proceed with the right-hand side of the slides showing a cultural view and the left-hand side a pathological view. Sorry, I just want to make sure I'm looking at it from your perspective. Okay, so these are a way of describing these two views. And we're going to unpack them a little bit and also share from some personal experience. So the pathological or medical view sees being deaf as a disability, as something that needs to be fixed. That view, if you think about it, really comes from thinking that it's normal to have hearing and to use spoken language. And anything that's different from that is not normal and needs to be fixed. But it can then make the difference between deaf people having the opportunity to learn through a visual language or not. And so the pathological view doesn't recognize the value of visual language. And I just want to say there's nothing wrong with having a disability, but the idea that there's only one way to describe normal is very limiting. And so we need to shift our focus to diversity and multiple definitions of normal. I identify myself as deaf. I use the capital D when I spell the word deaf to describe myself, because it is a way of describing my identity. You may notice other words out there like hearing impaired or having a hearing loss, but the deaf community prefers to be called deaf. The term hearing impaired, some people think, oh, isn't that the politically correct way to describe you? But in fact, no, it's insulting to deaf people. And so we don't feel that there's any negativity in being referred to as deaf.
There's one more.
We could just show the text for the right-hand side. There it is. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Kirsten. Right, so we can now go to the next slide. Okay. So the pathological view really focuses on physical hearing. They see being deaf as experiencing a sensory deficit, and they get focused on finding exactly what the problem is and how can we eliminate that problem. They spend a lot of time trying to classify hearing loss into different levels, and they will advise people that, oh, you're really going to struggle. It's going to be hard for you to manage and hard for you to hear. And some programs have been established specifically to try to help deaf people to hear better, because they're coming from a pathological perspective and believe that professionals should be really informed about audiology and technology for amplification and speech and language therapy and training and all those kinds of focuses. And a lot of money goes into developing technologies like hearing aids, cochlear implants, which is a kind of surgery to try to increase the ability of an ear to hear. And so it seems that the goal is to try to support a deaf person to become more hearing, to become more like a hearing person. But the cultural view says that deaf people are part of a group that share a language and cultural values. And, you know, every day I check social media and websites, and I hang out with deaf people who are the same as me. I'm a member of organizations for deaf people, volunteer with different sports activities and advocacy groups, youth groups that all comprise the deaf community. As a hearing person, I didn't know anything about the deaf community until when I was about 25, I became interested in learning ASL. And I had never actually met a deaf person. And I would say that I didn't realize what it means to be a hearing person until I started meeting deaf people and took a closer look at it. And when I worked with deaf kids and met deaf kids, it makes me become excited to see their potential and how they might become anything they want to be. Artists like my friend Zoe, medical doctors like Jessica, who's deaf, leaders in the community and teachers of ASL like Mari. And so it's a very different perspective, the cultural one, when compared to the pathological view. So let's move on to the next slide, the next aspect. There's a very long history to this. So I'll try not to take too much time on it, but you could think of 4 key points. There's lip reading, there's oralism, there's total communication, and there's mainstreaming. These are terms that you may encounter. So people talk about lip reading. Deaf people will tell you it's a very difficult task. It's a source of a lot of frustration. Oralism is the approach of teaching deaf people to use spoken language only and not to use sign language. Total communication is an educational philosophy that really was popular in the 1980s and supported speaking and signing at the same time. And I was actually a young student in school when that approach was most popular, and that has continued to be kind of ingrained in me. So that idea that you can combine English and ASL. It's taken me quite a lot of work to try to divorce myself from that. And often when you try to combine English with ASL, you just can't make good sense. So total communication is not ideal. And then the 4th one I mentioned was mainstreaming. That's the concept of having a deaf child, a deaf student placed in an educational setting where they're with other non-deaf students. And the last 3 that I mentioned typically rely a lot on technology, hearing aids, cochlear implants. But of course, when that becomes first and foremost, the technology becomes the focus and people forget about language itself. And the research has shown how language deprivation syndrome is actually a real and terrible thing. So people have been denied the opportunity to really develop accessible language and end up deprived of language. I want to talk briefly about mainstreaming because that's happening a lot right now. It's a popular concept. People talk about inclusion, the inclusion philosophy, which sounds nice. Let's include everybody, put them all together. And I was mainstreamed as a young student. But I have to say, it can be frustrating. If you're the only deaf student surrounded by hearing students, you might have an interpreter there, but it's still very isolating. Now, there is something in BC called the Provincial Resource Program, or there was a resource program at the school that I attended, so there was at least a few of us deaf students who went to the same school, and I could hang around with them and make friends, and they were my peer group. But often mainstreaming means only one deaf child in the whole school, and that's extremely isolating. So what is the best environment? I believe it's a deaf school. It's a school where all the students are using visual language, are using ASL, as are their teachers, and there's the opportunity for students to have access to everything that's being talked about around them so they can acquire language naturally. And it doesn't rely on technology and being able to hear better. And then the last thing I want to say on this is that it seems that there's a critical mass, a minimum number for deaf children to experience that sense of peers and community and access to language. And that's, I would say, like 8 to 10 deaf kids in the same educational program. Otherwise, it's a big struggle and a very isolating experience. So that's what I would say about that slide. I don't know if any of you have heard the term language deprivation before. Anybody? I don't think many hearing people experience that. Maybe a very few. Maybe some extreme stories you might have seen, like on YouTube, like a child who was raised by wolves, for example. It's very rare stories and experiences where a child grew up without any accessible language around them. Unfortunately, for deaf people, it is not rare. Deaf children do experience language deprivation often. It seems like a lot of hearing people have a built-in resistance to sign language. It's becoming more popular in a sense. You see lots of videos on YouTube and Facebook, but the medical professionals, audiologists, speech and language therapists, they still very strongly influence families with deaf children not to use sign language. Talk about sign language as if it were inferior to English, and that spoken language is better. I think maybe that goes with the slides. The next slide. There we go. Yeah, sorry, goes with this slide. So like I was saying, avoiding the use of sign language is part of the pathological view. In BC, if you are informed that your baby or your very young child is deaf, you will be referred to the early hearing program, and they will try to present options to the family. You could choose to use oral language only or sign language or both. But the parents will likely bring to this decision that sort of already internalized bias that spoken language, that English must be better than sign language. Back in the 1960s and 70s, there was some really important research done on American Sign Language. Linguists and neuroscientists studied and found out that sign language and spoken language are used by the brain in exactly the same way. The same parts of the brain are used to process language, whether it's spoken or signed. So that's interesting. And another important piece of information is there is a person, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get their name right, Dr. Gulati from Harvard University, who has been recently involved with mental health studies and has done a lot of research in connection with language deprivation, and has noticed that deaf adults with mental health issues in their history potentially experience language deprivation, and it had really long-term negative effects on developing themselves as a person, a sense of identity, thinking abilities. It's really sad when you think of that. Oh, right, and also I wanted to say, I just went to a conference in Alabama that focused on interpreting in mental health settings, and there was a psychologist there with lots of years of experience working with deaf clients, and who had also done lots of research. And found that 22% of deaf adults have a language disorder compared to 2% in the general hearing population. So that's an extreme number when you realize. So imagine a deaf child who is born with a brain ready to acquire and develop language, but isn't given that opportunity because they're not presented with accessible language. So again, I just want to emphasize visual language, ASL, is accessible to deaf children, whereas spoken language is not. When language can be taken in visually, a deaf person doesn't experience any barrier to doing that. And the brain is then happy because that's what it wants. It wants language. All right, so now you've seen us make some comments. Now, over to you. Also on your table, there's multiple choice. Oh, sorry, there's how to sign the letters A, B, C, D, and E. So the first few letters of the alphabet, the ASL alphabet, everybody find that piece of paper? There should be 4 at each table. So you don't have to learn the entire alphabet for this next part, but we'd like to see you try to do the first 5 letters, A, B, C, D, and E. Because what we're going to do is ask you to show your answer. So look up at the front, and we'll demonstrate those letters. And then once you practice them a little bit, we're going to ask you to use those letters to show the answer to our multiple choice questions by holding up your hand shape in either an A, a B, a C, a D, or an E. Okay, here we go. A. Everybody do an A. Doesn't matter if you're right-handed or left-handed, use whichever hand you prefer. That's A. And then B. C. And this is a hard one, D. Make sure you get the right finger up. See the shape of it? And the last one is an E. Great. Are you ready?
I can't quite figure out the G. Could you just do the G?
This is G. Luckily, you don't have to sign the G for this part. All right, you ready for the first question? Here it is. It's up on the screen. So please put your hand up and show either an A or a B, depending on what you think the right answer is. I want everybody to have a hand up, show either an A or a B, make a choice. Okay, the answer is B. It's false. It's false. All around the world, there are between 200 and 300 different signed languages. ASL is only one of those. There are multiple others. And in Canada, we have 3. We have ASL, American Sign Language, typically used by Anglophone people. Then we have, in Quebec, Francophone deaf people use LSQ, a different sign language. And then in the Indigenous communities, there are Indigenous sign languages. So, and not just one of those, a lot of variety there. So That's how it breaks down just in Canada. All right, here's question number 2. So which of these letters is true? And 2 of them are good descriptors, so you need to show 2 answers. You can use 1 letter on each hand. There you go. I can see some people trying to figure out how to get the right answer, like how to be ambiguous with the hand shape. You can't do that. Okay, so A is not correct. ASL is not a visual form of English. It is a completely different language. It has different grammar. It has different sentence structure, word order. It is not English. B is not correct. ASL is not mime. Mime is the use of gestures. ASL is much more than that. C is correct. C is one of the correct answers because ASL can express any ideas, including abstract ones, not just tangible things in our environment, but you could talk about any abstract idea in ASL. D is also incorrect, and E is correct because, well, one key difference between English and ASL, you could say, is the modality. Because English is spoken, comes out of your mouth, 1 word at a time, whereas ASL is visual and it uses 3D space, which is one reason why it's impossible to actually speak English and sign ASL at the same time. You can speak English and your hands could be doing some signs, but that's not ASL. You've lost the ASL grammar and a lot of the meaning and information would be lost if your hands were just trying to sign along with an English sentence. All right, so the next question. Let's see your answer up in the air. What's your answer, Kirsten? A. A is the correct answer. So when you think about what the face and head movements and eyes do in ASL, often if you're not a user of ASL and you're watching somebody using ASL, you might think, oh, they're very emotional right now. They look really angry. And people think all that facial expression is emotive, but that's not true. It's grammatical. So something to keep in mind if you're watching somebody using sign language, it's a complete language and you can't just see emotions in the expressions. Of course, it's both. Facial expressions in ASL are used for emotive purposes, but the primary function is grammatical. Here's question number 4. Which asks you, historically, which of these languages is ASL related to? A, B, C, or D? Let's see your answer. Don't be shy, just try. Just pick one. Give it a go. There's no points, there's no grade. You may be surprised at this answer. It's not A. It's not British Sign Language. Many people would assume, well, this is a mainly English-speaking environment here, so maybe because the British had a lot to do with colonizing this country, maybe British Sign Language is related to American Sign Language. But, well, and we also have to recognize that Indigenous people did and do have sign languages, but unfortunately there's not a whole lot of knowledge about that, and a lot of the historical record has been lost, but people are doing research about that. But the people who came to North America and established schools for the deaf, at the beginning, those were people from France. And they brought with them French Sign Language, and that had a big influence on ASL. So now if you compare present-day French Sign Language that they use in France and American Sign Language, there is about a 40% overlap in the vocabulary, what the signs look like. Oh, and then Jamie was just asking me to mention a little bit about LSQ, La Langue des Signes Québécoise. LSQ also has ties to French Sign Language because the first school for the deaf in a Francophone community was in Quebec, and it was run by Catholic nuns and priests, and they originated from France, and so they brought some knowledge of French Sign Language, and that had a big influence on LSQ. That's something that I didn't know. That wasn't taught to me as a deaf student. And that's part of deaf history that I didn't know for a long time, which is unfortunate. So as we said, there's ASL and LSQ and other languages. Then there are also dialects. There are regional variations. So sometimes a deaf person can recognize, oh, you sound like you're from BC, or you sound like you're from Ontario. So there are different regional accents or usages. And so as we travel around, we figure those out about each other in the broader deaf community. So that's interesting. So that's all those questions. You can rest easy about showing your choices. And if you want to keep that paper that has the whole alphabet on it, by all means, take it home and practice. You can learn how to fingerspell. So now we'll get back to the slides about the two views. This one is about the perception of role models. Who are the ideal role models? If you see communication as normal communication as being the way that hearing people communicate, then you may have a particular view on who would be a good role model. So we believe as deaf people that the ideal role models for young deaf people are deaf adults, but it's often not easy to find them. And I really believe this is true, that they are the best role models because they have the knowledge about the history of the community, and there are deaf seniors in our community that share things that I learn from all the time, like just an example of bits of information that I didn't learn from other people, I can learn from older deaf people. But the pathological view would say, and what has typically happened is that role models who are deaf aren't presented to families with young deaf children, and that also wasn't part of my history, and it isn't common in the community, which is unfortunate. Okay, let's look at the next slide, please. So this connects to the previous slide as well, about the belief that deaf children should aspire to hearing role models, and they believe that how to make it happen is to prevent deaf children from hanging around with other deaf people. They should be integrated with hearing people, would be the belief. And so if you were resistant to exposing a deaf child to learning to sign, then how would they be able to meet other deaf people and connect with other deaf people and become more aware of who they are as a deaf person. They need role models that they can model their own identity after and aspire to be like, etc. So in the 1980s, well, in the 1880s, sorry, you're familiar with the person, Alexander Graham Bell. I'm sure you've heard his name. The inventor of the telephone. He's famous for that. But it's interesting that he had some really horrible beliefs about deaf people, and he was really a fan of eugenics. He felt that if we permit deaf people to hang out with other deaf people, they will marry and they'll give birth to other deaf people, and they'll all use sign language and won't succeed, and they will give up on the idea of learning speech, which would be a bad thing, and they'll only want to be with deaf people. So in the deaf community, Alexander Graham Bell has a really bad name as speaking out publicly against deaf people being able to socialize with other deaf people, marry other deaf people, or use sign language. He was a fan of the oral-only approach, and he was strongly against sign language. And his name lives on in oral organizations today. There is a national organization in the States with his name that supports only spoken language, not sign language. So if you Google his name in that respect, you'll find out information about the A.G. Bell Society. So again, yeah, he's not a good guy in the deaf community. So this one focuses on professional people and how they should be trained. If they're aiming to get master's or doctor's degrees, where should their focus be? And I think that in that whole sector, the cultural view is really missing. So if you think about speech therapists and teachers, they have not espoused the cultural view. They haven't been taught it, they haven't been exposed to it in their education, and they're simply unaware of it often. And a good example of that is if you're born here in BC, there's universal newborn hearing screening now. And if the test shows that you are deaf or hard of hearing, you will be labeled as having a hearing loss. And that will be presented to the parents. And there haven't had any deaf people consulted in establishing what is the message that parents get when their baby is first diagnosed. And that's where bias comes in, because professionals don't realize, they think they're doing the best thing, but even in the terminology they use, they could be damaging. Another example is in school, when I saw for myself, but also other deaf students have shared their experiences, that the intake process would not have any cultural sensitivity. There would be misunderstandings and things that the people at the institution wouldn't realize about where the best placement for a deaf child might be. Oh, so you're talking about college, at post-secondary level. Yes. I think that post-secondary students have to have a lot of patience if they're deaf or hard of hearing when applying or trying to communicate at an educational institution, because there's not people working there who have had exposure to the cultural view or have had the training or background. And I wanted to add one more thing too. The diagnosis of hearing loss, the people who do that, and then, or the professionals who have the degrees, they typically are seen as knowing everything, and they are then more empowered, and so they perpetuate those beliefs. And I think we need to look at that power. Is that correct? How can we change that? How can we shift the professionals to take on a different path and expand their view, and so not devalue the cultural view? That's something I don't see happening. I believe that this is really dangerous when the medical view and its bias seeps into and links with Audism. And the next slide uses that term. Here are some definitions of the word Audism, how a few different people have explained it. It's not a brand new concept. It's been around since about 1975, that term. So we'll just give you a moment to read this slide. So then I want to call your attention to the last part of the slide, and the word ally, defined as a person who's not a member of a particular group, but who supports that group. And I want to talk about three things that an ally does. For example, if you're hosting an event, please, for example, here at BCIT, if you're hosting an event, please on the website say that you have booked interpreters or will provide interpreters, or that if you need interpreters, let us know by a certain deadline. And for example, the diversity circles are good at doing this, and you can check that website for an example. Secondly, I suggest that you put a budget line in the budget at BCIT for interpreting for the whole institution, so that things can become accessible via booking of interpreters, and there's already thought given to that ahead of time. And please contact me for more specific information about the costs, etc. I can advise on that. And I just wanted to add to that comment. I am an interpreter myself. Most of the time, I do work throughout the community where people work, or at artistic events and performances, or a whole variety of jobs. I also interpret at medical appointments. And often, I'm contacted by a group who is planning an event, and a deaf person has asked if they could go to that event. And so then I'm contacted, and I'm asked to tell what the professional fees would be, and they're always shocked to say, we can't afford that. And so then they ask, am I willing to volunteer? And then that presents a really big conflict for me, because of course I would love for deaf people to be able to go to all the events they want to go to, but I can't volunteer all the time. It is my job and my profession to be an interpreter. So I think the point is, as Jamie was making too, to plan ahead, to budget, to think about access, and not until it's down to the wire and the event is about to happen. And also, think about it globally or throughout the whole institution. There, I'm sure, are budget lines that are for everybody in the institution to use. So that would open more doors if it was a consideration across the board, not just for specific events and one-offs. And then the third point I want to make is to do with training. I do see that some departments at BCIT teach students who are going out there in their future careers, or I would like to see them, get training about encountering people who are in the deaf community and how they can take an ally stance. So I think the curriculum that is taught here at BCIT could include a focus on unconscious bias and the theme of Audism and how to reduce those, because that is currently not happening. And I think some departments do have direct connections with deaf students, but my goal would like to be to see more allies produced and have it embedded into the curriculum throughout BCIT, so that when students go out and work with deaf people, they are ready to do that with the right approach. Just want to ask Shannon, do we have, if I got it right, we got 10 minutes left? Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to thank a few people, and then we'll also have a few minutes for Q&A. So if anyone has questions, we could probably address those. And yes, you could also approach me afterwards, one-on-one, if you'd like to. Yeah, we probably have time for a couple of questions. If there's a burning question you're dying to ask, by all means, go for it. Maybe you want some more clarification on something or ask about a particular term. Anybody want to ask a question? Oh, good, a brave person. Go for it.
Trina, next. Can you give us examples of successful deaf people as role models? I don't know of any.
There's Jamie. There are many. I would say, firstly, my sister. My sister is deaf. You saw her briefly in the Why I Sign video involved with the DYT program. She has her own business, focusing on supporting families with children aged 0 to 5 who are deaf and hard of hearing. She works with families and parents, and she is definitely a success story. There are a lot of famous deaf people in the sports arena. There's Deaf Olympics, and there's a lot of ways for deaf people to engage with each other through sporting events. I could also think of lots of deaf people worth mentioning, but I think you have to ask yourself what you mean by successful. For me, a deaf person is successful when they have full language, a strong sense of identity, know who they are, and feel they can express themselves and connect with others. And that's, I think, the key definition of success. Success can also mean got a good job, make good money, contribute to society. That's a bit of a cliche, but I do know many really accomplished deaf people who would fit both definitions of success, for sure. And lots of my friends. Another question, I think?
Yes. If we wanted to learn ASL, is there a local place that you would recommend for us to go learn, or a course?
That's a good question. On the table, there is a form that has a list of resources, and so you can see they're categorized a little bit. So there's some ideas there, depending on where you live. There might be night classes available near where you live. So that would answer your question, I think. And I think, sorry, we probably have to cut it off there. Oh, okay. One more. Or go ahead.
Hi, I'm Trisha. I'm with Accessibility Services, and I have a question around mainstreaming and supporting students whom have been schooled in like in a deaf school for high school, and then are transitioning to post-secondary. And we at Accessibility Services, for example, we look at course essential requirements, and like most of the knowledge demonstration is with reading and with writing. And I'm just wondering about supporting instructors to evaluate deaf students in their reading and written expression if they don't communicate in the same way, or are they taught to communicate with reading and writing in English in the same way as the other typical students? Good question, sorry.
Very big. It is big. Yeah, it's a huge question because it depends on so many things. Where did the student go to school? Their sense of identity, their language use. I think if I could attempt my best answer, I would suggest maybe contact Gallaudet University. I don't know of a particular name right now, but you could talk to people at Gallaudet University, which is a university that uses ASL and also teaches ASL and has a long history of evaluating post-secondary studies when ASL is the language being used. Yeah, I would agree. I think another resource locally would be at BCIT, you have the PCAS office, and PCAS stands for Post-Secondary Communication Access Services. And that's a provincial resource. They know a lot about, they have a lot of information about accessibility and how student services offices throughout the province can accommodate deaf or hard of hearing college students when they embark on their, or take up post-secondary studies. That would be a short answer, is get in touch with PCAS. And I would also encourage you to think about what we've been saying in the presentation about the different views, and maybe you can, with this new information, maybe you can realize that if you hold a pathological view, then decisions that you make, and if you think about the deaf student that presents themselves here, they may have been, their education was the result of a lot of people coming from the pathological view and the decisions they made about language use. So then it creates a big challenge for how do you move forward. But that's why Jamie and I feel so passionate about getting this message out and about getting you to think more about these topics. And it's very complex. There's no one simple answer, but I would encourage you to contact PCAS and, like Jamie said, Gallaudet University. And I was a BCIT student, and at that time it wasn't called Accessibility Services, it was called DRC, Disability Resource Center. So I have some of that experience in my past about trying to go through the intake process, but I just think there isn't enough system-wide understanding of the changes that need to happen. So I think, you know, it's up to the deaf student to kind of make their way as opposed to the system making it, paving the way for them. So I think the first step is to look at the system and how it can be more accommodating. All right, sorry, but I think we have to cut it off here. And I just want to thank, I'm trying to remember who first contacted me to invite me. I think it might have been Piper, and then was in touch with Jamie. Yeah, it started with Piper. So I feel very involved very honored to be involved with this, and I look forward to the work of the diversity circles. I thank Shannon and Za. I think your work is amazing, and Kyla. Thank you, Sarah and Piper, for interpreting today. It's been great. Yeah, and I would thank the same people, and also thanks to my department, as well as diversity circles. We've been through a lot, my department and I, learning through our frustrations, how to improve communication, and so I'm grateful for all of that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Sarah. Thank you so much, Jamie and Kirsten. really amazing presentation. And we're really honored to be celebrating the International Week of Sign Language, but also I'm sure everyone in the audience can see that the contrast between the pathological view and the cultural view applies across many, many contexts. We're focusing on, as we said in the description, through the lens of autism, but I'm sure you can see how valuable it is to compare those two paradigms and apply it in so many ways to the work that we do. So thank you for such an informative and engaging presentation. It was an honor working with the team, including the planning committee, to bring this event to fruition. And for me, as someone who teaches communication as my profession, it was a real eye-opener for me to really look at my own presuppositions about what is communication and what that entails. So it was a great journey for me, and I appreciate your support and everyone's support. So thank you, everyone, for sharing your time. We are happy to be finishing a few minutes early, so you can get seconds if you want seconds. You can approach the presenters, remembering that American Sign Language will be involved. I want to encourage you to take the notepads home with you, as well as taking some food. And if you didn't sign in yet, Kyla has the sign-up sheet. So thank you again for everything, and thanks for your support of Diversity Circles.